You're listening to President Trump taking a series of questions in the Oval Office on a range of different topics. The biggest headline related to Iran, we'll get to that in one moment. We do want to just note one thing. President Trump saying that he won Minnesota 3 times. In fact, he lost 3 times. Let's get to the biggest headlines on Iran, though. President Trump saying there may be a deal that gets finished as soon as this weekend. He was asked whether the Supreme Leader has signed off on the deal. He said he believes the answer is yes. He was pressed on why is this time different. He's expressed optimism that he perhaps has a deal in the past. President Trump saying because they've taken a pounding. He describes it as a memorandum of understanding, saying it's a little conceptual, wouldn't give a deadline on when the fine print needs to be worked out in terms of how specifically the nuclear enrichment program would be dismantled and the nuclear material would be removed. He also was asked about his statement previously this week saying that he believed Iran might be tapping the U.S. along. Why does he think that they're being sincere now? He says because there is lots of enthusiasm to get a deal done. He was asked about a range of different topics, but let's stay right there and bring in our team of reporters. Joining me now, NBC's Gabe Gutierrez at the White House. Richard Engel is in Jerusalem, and also with me, senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube and business and data reporter Brian Cheung. Gabe, let me start with you at the White House. What exactly do you know about this deal that President Trump is touting? He says could be done this weekend, says he could sign it potentially when he goes to the G7 summit in Europe.
Well, certainly there are a lot of questions that we're asking right now, Kristen, of White House officials to get the exact details here. You laid it out, this so-called memorandum of understanding, and he said that it could be signed this week. And he also suggested it might be Vice President J.D. Vance that goes ahead and sign this because he can't be there, although he did say that the timing is very fluid. Of course, this weekend, there's the UFC fight scheduled here at the White House. You may be able to hear the sound check behind me. That's underway right now. And then next week, he does head to Europe for that G7 summit. But Kristen, taking a step back here, this has been just some incredible whiplash throughout the day. Earlier today, the president saying that he planned to hit Iran very hard once again tonight after there was that back and forth last night with the U.S. attacking and sending dozens of Tomahawk missiles into Iran, Iran retaliating. And then it was just a few hours ago, Kristen, that the president posted that he was canceling these strikes because of this so-called deal that he now calls a memorandum of understanding. And the news there that you referenced that he does say that the Iranian Supreme Leader has agreed to this, although we don't have confirmation of that. The president also saying that many other countries have agreed to this in his initial post. But in terms of specifics here, the president saying that under no way, shape or form that Iran will have a nuclear weapon. But he has been saying this now for quite some time, and it's unclear what has changed from Iran's point of view in the last few hours. The president trying to argue that it was the sheer military force by the United States pounding Iran that had caused them to agree to this memorandum of understanding. But details are scarce at this point, Chris.
Gabe, stand by for us. Let me head to Richard Engel. Richard, I understand that you have some new reaction from Prime Minister Netanyahu. What are you hearing?
So Prime Minister Netanyahu has just moments ago put out a statement, their reaction to this announcement by President Trump. And I have it in front of me. I'll read it in 1 second. And our understanding is that, as you were just discussing, this is a two-phase deal, that there will be an initial signing potentially this weekend that would open the Strait of Hormuz, have some general language about a commitment not to have a nuclear weapon. And then there would be a detailed period of negotiations. Earlier, we'd been discussing maybe 60 days, maybe 90 days, but a couple of months. So with that in mind, this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu's office just put out. Said President Trump spoke this evening with Prime Minister Netanyahu about the memorandum of understanding being formed with Iran to enter into negotiations. So it's being described as a memorandum of understanding to enter into negotiations. Although Israel is not a party to the memorandum of understanding, the prime minister expressed his appreciation for President Trump's commitment that the final agreement at the end of the negotiations will include the removal of enriched material, dismantling of enrichment infrastructure, limiting missile production, and ending Iran's support for its terrorist proxies in the region. Now, those are the demands that Prime Minister Netanyahu has had since the beginning of the conflict. He is saying that President Trump has given him a commitment that those demands will be met at the end of some final status negotiations after this memorandum of understanding is signed, if it is signed. President Trump hasn't publicly said that he is committed to these terms, but this is a way for Netanyahu to tell the Israeli people that his demands in this war are going to be met. But his demands do not necessarily overlap with President Trump's demands. We've heard President Trump say that he will sign a deal, he sets the terms, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to agree with it. One thing in particular, in this statement from the Prime Minister's office, he talked about how he agreed with President Trump that the material would have to be removed from Iran. This is what he calls the highly enriched uranium, or the nuclear dust. He didn't say that in this press conference. He said it's so buried under mountains, we basically don't need to worry about it because of the B-52 attacks. He said that the entire infrastructure that Iran uses to produce nuclear weapons would be dismantled. President Trump didn't commit to that either. He was thin on details. And then finally, this one key issue, he said support for terrorist proxies, ending Iran's support for terrorist proxies. That's a veiled way of Israel talking about the war in Lebanon, where it is fighting against Hezbollah. And in the past, Iran's commitment to not signing a deal unless there is a full peace deal in Lebanon has derailed this process. So even if there is this signing of a memorandum of understanding, potentially this weekend, based on this statement right here, the phase after that to negotiate a final deal could be quite complicated.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Richard. Put this into broader context for us, if you can, because basically this is an agreement to talk about the toughest issues. We all remember it took 2 years to negotiate the JCPOA under the former Obama administration, and there are a number of sticking points here. Just how complicated are those remaining sticking points, Richard?
Well, just look at the Strait of Hormuz as one of many examples. So President Trump said that as soon as this deal is signed, the Strait of Hormuz would be open. He said that it's been open, that the U.S. has secretly been removing oil and getting it to the markets and hiding it, but the Strait of Hormuz has not been open. If you look at it or talk to commercial shipping companies, there have been boats that have been stranded there. Sailors have been killed by U.S. attacks, by Iranian drones. The Strait of Hormuz has been blocked. So if the Strait of Hormuz opens upon the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding, President Trump says that the U.S. blockade of Iran, which is just off of the Strait of Hormuz, because we have two competing blockades here. You have the Iranian blockade trying to close the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, and the American military blockade closing Iranian ports. He has said that that blockade would stay in force until there is this final negotiated settlement. That means American warships stay very close to Iran. So it means that there could be an escalation, a flare-up, and we could see a resumption of hostilities. It's a possibility, but as long as you put military hardware off of a country's coast, that while you're still negotiating, there is always that danger.
Yeah, why it is so challenging to unwind these conflicts. Richard Engel, thank you so very much. Please stay safe. We really appreciate your reporting. Courtney, Kube, let me turn to you now. Gabe Gutierrez laid it out very well. This has been a day of whiplash. It started with President Trump with a very stern warning. In fact, I just want to remind people of what exactly he said, this threat to hit Iran hard tonight. Take a listen.
We just made a great settlement of the war with Iran, and we're going to be subject to finalization of documents, which should get done over the next few days. We'll probably have a signing maybe in Europe, and Great thing. Stock market's up 1,000 points. That means they like the deal. See, that means they like. If the market goes down, that means they don't like the deal. But it's been up. Oil's dropped. Oil will start coming down to, I think, even lower than it was before. Most importantly, we have a deal that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, which was the whole purpose of what we had to go through to get this. So it was a big, very big thing. But we have a signing soon, and the documents are in pretty final shape.
We dropped $250 million worth of bombs on them last night. You know, the whole thing is crazy. But they're really in submission. They just don't know it yet. Okay, to be honest with you, they just don't know it yet. And we are talking to them and all. But you know, look, my preference has always been take Cargill. And
will it be more bombing tonight?
Yeah, there will be more bombing tonight. It'll be a bigger, more powerful.
It's going to be bigger and more powerful, Court. And now here we are with the president saying he does think a deal could be finalized, a memorandum of understanding by this weekend. What's been the reaction within the Pentagon to this whiplash?
So, I mean, it's not just us who are watching this and saying what's going to be the next move here. The military is in that same boat. And even when we talk about something like the blockade, the president in one of his earlier social media postings said that the blockade would be removed subject to finalization of the document, something similar to what he just said there. So, but what is that? When would that be? Is that the memorandum of understanding that he just spoke about in the Oval Office that could, as he said, be signed in a matter of days? Or is this another deal? If, in fact, as Richard was just reporting, this is a memorandum to talk about negotiating over issues, does that mean the blockade could be in effect throughout the course of those negotiations? Why that's so significant to the U.S. military is they still have a huge footprint there. Enforcing that blockade, 2 carrier strike groups, about 200 aircraft are associated with that. And you can see that even on just a normal day of enforcing the blockade and monitoring the region, we can have a potential catastrophe like the downing of that Apache helicopter from earlier this week. I mean, the 2 pilots, the 2 crew members, both survived that. But that could have had a very different outcome and much bigger strategic implications. And that's the big question here. If, in fact, the militaries continue to operate these competing blockades, that's the Iranian military and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, essentially competing with a blockade on the other side of the strait with the United States military, if they keep operating in this close proximity, will we just continue to have more and more close calls that could ultimately have a larger strategic impact on these ongoing negotiations or potentially the next level of negotiations here? So meanwhile, the U.S. military in some ways is caught in the middle of it because they're carrying out their orders to enforce this blockade, to, as President Trump has been talking about, to continue to coordinate with a very small number of ships that are moving through the Strait of Hormuz and have been for the last month or so. He likes to call this a secret plan, but it's actually been reported publicly that the U.S. military was coordinating with these ships. And again, it's a small number. It's about 200 over the course of the last 5 weeks or so that have moved in or out of the Strait of Hormuz. That mission still comes with peril. As we have seen, Iran is launching off drones. One thing that's not clear here is, does this memorandum of understanding include an agreement from Iran to no longer provoke or escalate in any way their actions in the Strait of Hormuz? Will they stop launching drones and fast boats and even some surface-to-air missiles in the Strait of Hormuz so that truly shipping can move through without any real peril? That's one thing we don't know. And the nuclear question still really remains uncertain here. President Trump was asked about that just now, and instead he repeated the same thing that we have heard from him and some of his administration officials, that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, but he doesn't say exactly how they are going to ensure that that is the case, Kristen.
And, Court, as you and I know, because we've been covering this for years, that's, of course, the thorniest issue. All right, Courtney, Kube, thank you so very much for listening along and your reporting and reaction. Let me turn now to Brian Cheung. So, Brian, markets closed just moments ago, reacting quite strongly to the news of a potential announcement. Talk to us about what we're seeing in the markets, whiplash as well in the markets, right, Brian?
Yeah, Kristen, you can see there that the Dow Jones ended the day almost 1,000 points up. That's almost 2% up. It looked like we were going to continue the spill of red days this week. Obviously, the developments around the war with Iran has flipped that around. And you heard the president, who often uses the stock market as a metric system, as a kind of a measuring stick, if you will, over his policies, pointing to the fact that the markets were up as substantially as they were today. This is obviously part of the overall theme that we've been covering since the beginning of this war, which is that when there is some light at the end of the tunnel, or appears to be light at the end of the tunnel on this conflict, you see investors react positively. That was certainly the case today. And you do have to remember that this is within the context of a week where we got some pretty bad economic numbers on inflation. Perhaps maybe this was one way that the president wanted to try to flip markets into the green after announcing on Truth Social about 2.5 hours before the market end that there was going to be this cancellation of the strikes later on this evening. So when you talk about what's going on here with the economy, of course, affordability does remain a big thorn in the side of this administration, and higher gas prices, which are averaging $4.12 a gallon nationally today, certainly not helping, even though that is about 40 cents lower than it was about a month ago. That is a big reason why you see numbers like the Producer Price Index. This is the amount of inflation that the retailers that we buy from experience. So again, this is not the inflation that we at a consumer level face. It's the retailer facing it. But that rising by 6.5% year over year in May. Kristen, you would have to go back to November 2022 to see a number that high. And again, 2022 was around peak inflation during the Biden years, certainly context that the Trump administration does not want to be compared to.
All right. Brian Cheung, as always, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.